The year 2001 marked a monumental turning point in international geopolitics. The terror attacks on the Twin Towers in New York City on the 11th of September 2001 would not remain an American issue alone. Soon enough, the US's war on terror would involve US allies fighting either proxy battles and wars for the US or fighting battles against fundamentalism and extremism in their own interest. In the Philippines, we have grown up with the many conflicts in Mindanao, and somehow we really have not known a period of absolute peace. I do not think any generation has, actually. And whilst the Philippines has known turbulent and less turbulent years of Muslim Mindanao relations with peace talks and ceasefires here and there, the problems took on a much complicated dimension after 9/11. Suddenly, the Filipino government had to be confronted by the fact that a Southeast Asian militant group hell-bent on establishing an Islamic state in the region has cells in Mindanao. The group was and is operating mainly in Maguindanao to orchestrate terrorist attacks whenever and wherever they could. So, in the past, a response was, of course, needed. In January 2015, a police operation was put together to capture and/or kill a high-ranking terrorist and his Filipino aide in Maguindanao. The operation looked like it was going well. The units were prepared, but what followed, however, would go down as one of the darkest chapters in Filipino history, not only because of the casualties, but also because of the seemingly deeply flawed operation planning that preceded said operation. This is the story of the Mamasapano clash, the fall of the SAF 44. Mabuhay! You are listening to Lagim, a Filipino True Crime Podcast. I am your host, Christine. Make sure to listen till the very end of this episode because I have a tiny bit of a surprise. As always, please note that this episode contains details that could be very upsetting and disturbing for some people. So please make sure to take care of yourself whilst listening. In January 2015, 3 teams of the Philippine National Police Special Armed Forces or SAF made their way into Maguindanao to start executing Oplan Exodus or Operation Exodus. The mission was to capture and/or kill high-value targets, one of which was a Malaysian member of the Jemaah Islamiyah, a hardliner Islamist rebel group that originated in Indonesia. This Malaysian citizen was Zulkifli Abdir, better known by his nom de guerre, Marwan. Before January that year, the PNP had previously received intelligence that Marwan was hiding in Mamasapano in Maguindanao. The PNP had previously put together many operations that had to be aborted due to various reasons, but by January 2015, the troops were ready and had their eyes set on capturing and or neutralizing their terrorist targets, especially Marwan and his Filipino aide Abdul Basit Usman. The 3 units were composed of the following: 36 elite cops from the 55th SAF Company, who would serve as the blocking force in Barangay Tucanalipao in Mamasapano. There were also 27 elite cops from the 84th SAF Company, also called the Seaborne Unit, who were the ones tasked to arrest Marwan and Usman. There were also a team of around 300 SAF troopers who were deployed away from the battle zone and who were ordered to be on standby. They were not part of the attacking or blocking forces, and I can only assume that they were not armed as such either. But before I continue with what happened that January day, I think there is merit in understanding how Marwan got to the Philippines. Sometimes when these things happen in our country, we view them very much in isolation from the wider affairs of the world when really we are so interconnected and interdependent. As I hinted already in the intro, I would argue that what happened to the SAF troopers really started with the terrorist attacks in New York City on 9/11. The social and political landscape of the world forever changed that day, and suddenly the world was made aware of terrorism dangers that did not operate in one country alone, but had sophisticated networks of terrorist sleeper cells all over the world. A decade later, and after Osama bin Laden was killed in a US special operations in Pakistan, the expectation was that the Al Qaeda network would lose power, influence, and momentum. But unfortunately, that was not the case. One network member that stayed strong and eager to please the new leaders of the Al Qaeda network was Jemaah Islamiyah, or JI. They are best known for terrorist attacks in Southeast Asia, but most prominently for the Bali bombing in 2002. The Filipino cells of JI were connected to the MILF, or the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and so it is and was through this connection that Islamist rebels were able to acquire training and weapons for their rebel activities in the Philippines. The JI had and has a huge plan to establish a caliphate in Southeast Asia. This plan would include overthrowing several governments, such as those in Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and also the Philippines. But the main goal in the Philippines is to reclaim the island of Mindanao. With that being said, JI continued their influence and training in Mindanao that started around the early 90s. This was to make sure that the Filipino JI cells were and are ready for whatever was needed to be done to realize the plan of having this caliphate. In the late 90s, Jemaah Islamiyah received instructions from Osama bin Laden himself, who urged everyone in the Al Qaeda network to target Westerners and Western establishments. Some JI leaders were not in favor of doing so, seeing possible pitfalls in such a brazen undertaking. However, their voices were in the minority. The majority of the leaders were very much willing to follow bin Laden's instructions, and one of the most hardline and vocal people to do so was Zulkifli Abdir, or Marwan. Marwan was the mastermind of many attacks in the Philippines, and after the Bali bombing in 2002, which he orchestrated, he would be propelled to the top of the FBI's most wanted list. The Filipino police authorities, most specifically the PNP, or Philippine National Police, were aware as early as 2010 that Marwan might be in the country, and operations were planned to capture him. As I said, a lot of them were not successful or had to be aborted. However, things became a bit more serious when intelligence reached the PNP about Marwan's possible plot to kill Pope Francis, who was scheduled to visit the Philippines in 2015. And this really brings us back to January 2015, when things were in place to finally get to where Marwan was allegedly hiding. Now, when researching this episode, I found the documentary Fallen But Not Forgotten on iTunes really helpful in understanding how the SAF troopers perceived their situation whilst they were on their mission. Details about what they did not know or what was communicated between their superiors were not really included that much in that documentary, and it certainly left a lot of questions open for me. However, As you will see in my sources list, there has been extensive reporting during the time. And if you want to have a good overview of the timeline of events, then do head to Rappler's timeline of the Mamasapano clash, the link of which is also in my sources list. According to reports at the time, there were only a few people who were privy to Oplan Exodus. President Noynoy Aquino was briefed, as well as then local government secretary Mar Rojas. Now, the person responsible for planning the operation was then PNP Chief Director General Alan Purisima. More to this guy later. So, operations such as Oplan Exodus would normally be planned with the input of the military. But with Exodus, the military was not made aware at all that the PNP was planning to send in their SAF troopers to capture Marwan. Initially, the reason given as to why the AFP, or the Armed Forces of the Philippines, was not informed was that important peace talks were taking place between the government, the army, and the MILF. And informing the army about Exodus may endanger these peace talks. Later, we will see that things were a bit more complicated than this reason given. So, what happened in January 2015? After a briefing at 6 o'clock in the evening on the 24th of January, the SAF troopers traveled for around 2.5 hours to get to their entrance point into Mamasapano. By 10 in the evening, and after hiking and walking, the seaborne unit had to cross their first of many rivers. They had a local guide with them, but for some reason, this guide could not remember the landmarks and could not guide them properly. The troopers, therefore, had to rely on their GPS equipment. But soon enough, they realized that their equipment was malfunctioning. The SAF troopers reckoned that the cloudy weather and the thick and tall vegetation may have contributed to the GPS equipment not working properly, and was also most probably the reason that the guide could not remember where the landmarks were, or how to navigate the troopers to the target area. Nevertheless, they soldiered on. By 2:30, the seaborne unit crossed yet another river, and it was here that they had come across a few more difficulties. Due to the darkness and the urgency to get to Marwan before daybreak, as well as the river's current, not all members of the seaborne unit were able to advance to where Marwan was hiding. It is my understanding that the first 13 troopers who were able to cross the river were the ones who decided to go ahead and continue to seek Marwan's hiding place. It is unclear to me, however, whether the other 24 troopers then followed. It was also at this point when an army unit spotted the SAF troopers entering Barangay Tucanalipao. It is unclear whether they had passed on this information to their army superiors or whether they had exchanged words with the troopers. The SAF troopers, on the other hand, were told that the army would be informed about Exodus once the troopers had reached Marwan's hiding place. More to this later as well. So at this point, you can imagine that the 13 troopers of the seaborne unit were very tired, just like the rest of the unit. They needed to get to Marwan before dawn because staying in the area would be risking being exposed to those who were protecting Marwan. So by 4:15 in the morning, the unit finally reached the hut that was allegedly being used by Marwan. They took their positions, getting ready to execute orders. Suddenly, an explosion came from inside the hut. The troopers interpreted this as hostile fire and began firing at the hut. They then heard someone yell, "Allahu Akbar," and they presumed it was Marwan. The troopers, having assessed that no one was attacking or firing at them anymore, proceeded to enter the hut and found the body of a lifeless man. They looked at him and the photos they had with them of Marwan, and there was a consensus that this man was him. The orders were to get a retina scan of Marwan and sample bodily fluids, but the commanding officer had to make an executive decision whether there was enough time to do all this, knowing that daybreak was approaching. It was therefore decided in the end that time was of the essence, and instead of getting a retina scan and a biological sample from Marwan, one of the troopers was asked to cut off a finger from him so that this may be used for DNA testing. As for the Filipino aide Usman, he was able to escape and was nowhere to be found. Now, just for the sake of completeness here, Usman would later be killed in a separate operation by the PNP SAF. Anyway, back to the Seaborne unit. This unit then hurriedly left the hut and made their long way back, preparing for extraction. As they prepared to do so, they came under heavy fire from rebels who had now learned about the ambush on Marwan. The commanding officer of the Seaborne unit ordered his troops not to fire back, as that would give away their position. So far, no one had died, but they did have one injured trooper who would later explain that the injury was not severe, but it did make it difficult to move around whilst also trying to avoid getting shot at. Now, a few kilometers away, as you would remember, the 55th SAF Company was standing by to provide the Seaborne unit with assistance. They were also ordered to not fire unless fired upon. Thinking that this mission was nearly over, the 55th unit could not anticipate what happened next. At this point, they had become surrounded and trapped by rebels and could neither retreat nor provide support to the Seaborne unit. By 7:30 in the morning, and not knowing what had happened to the 55th unit, the Seaborne unit continued their attempt to get as near as they could to their fellow troopers. This was when they heard the shots fired at the 55th unit. The Seaborne unit decided that they needed to take cover, as they also had now learned that their location was so close to the rebel camp that they were a mere few meters away from them. The 55th unit, whilst under heavy fire, was still looking for signs of their fellow troopers in the Seaborne unit, who they believed should be meeting them anytime soon. The Seaborne unit was then ordered to come to the rescue of the 55th unit, which to them was just the most bizarre twist of events because the original plan was for the other unit to help them. But both units would gradually realize that nothing during that day went according to plan. The commanding officer of the Seaborne unit was also wondering why on earth were the 300 other SAF troopers who were waiting near the highway not called in to help the two units under fire. Reports later would indicate that the reason the 300 other SAF troopers were not called in was that they were not sufficiently armed, at least not on a level that would be effective in providing their fellow troopers with adequate support. I find this hard to accept, but then again, I am just a lay person looking at this story about a military-like police operation, which was obviously more complicated and complex than I thought it would be. So the Seaborne unit was preparing to come to their colleagues' rescue, and they quickly realized that they needed to not only penetrate heavy vegetation to get to the 55th unit, but they also needed to confront the rebels that were camped out between them and that other unit. At first, they tried to hide, but one of the rebels suddenly saw one of the troopers and shot at him. This started an exchange of fire that led to the Seaborne unit confronting the rebels in their encampment. There were at least 70 rebels, and despite being outnumbered, the Seaborne unit were successful in killing some rebels and scaring the others away. They were finally inching closer to where the 55th unit was located. As they finally arrived at the edge of where they knew their fellow troopers were, they fired a few shots to let them know that they were there to assist them. However, instead of the two units finally reuniting, the shots that were fired by the seaborne unit caused the rebels to locate their position. As a result, they were mortared. The seaborne unit thought that the 55th unit mistakenly fired mortars at them, and after a hectic query through radio comms, it was confirmed that the seaborne unit was being attacked or was being mortared by the rebels. The seaborne unit felt demoralized as soon as they heard this, but there was no time to feel that way for too long because the seaborne unit needed to take immediate cover from the mortars being fired by the rebels. As a result, the 55th unit could not be supported and continued to sustain heavy casualties from being fired on by the rebels. At this point, news about the encounter in Mamasapano had reached some government officials who then made a desperate plea to the MILF leaders to agree to a ceasefire. In principle, both the government and the MILF leaders agreed to the ceasefire at some point that morning. The commanding officer of the SAF contacted the seaborne unit and informed them about the ceasefire, ordering them to stand down. The unit was happy to do so and followed orders, but it became clear quite quickly that the rebels used this ceasefire to regroup and then open fire again, thus breaking the ceasefire an hour after it was agreed. What the seaborne unit could not know in the midst of all the chaos that they had to deal with was that the 55th unit was as good as gone. It would later turn out that out of the 36 troopers dispatched in that unit, only one person survived. The unit was too exposed, and the rebels easily targeted the troopers from where they had regrouped during the ceasefire. Whilst the lone survivor of the 55th unit was trying to see if anyone at all had survived in his unit, the seaborne unit troopers were still trying to find a way to get to the other unit. They thought that if they could just reach this one river, they could make good headway and be closer to their fellow troopers. So, despite the hunger, tiredness, and thirst, they made their way to the river in twos. They were still sustaining heavy fire, and it became clear to the seaborne unit that they were more heavily surrounded than originally thought. So they were forced to take refuge in a cornfield, and they kept crawling, not wanting to be seen by the rebels. The situation was getting desperate. The energy was all but gone. One seaborne unit trooper had the idea of snapping off some nearby sugarcane to munch on. The sugar should give the troopers a bit of energy. Others in the unit had some IV fluid with them and used that to help with hydration and also with energy. But this could not last forever, and I think the troopers knew that amidst the continuous fire from the rebels. As the day went on, the seaborne unit considered the possibility that they may have to spend the night hiding in the cornfield, either holding their ground against the rebels or making their last stand, thereby being ready to die. I can only imagine that at this point, despite being trained for hardships and battle, even the toughest SAF trooper would have felt a little bit hopeless. In the documentary Fallen Not Forgotten, this was confirmed. Survivors of the Mamasapano clash explained how they started calling and texting their loved ones, telling them how they loved them, informing them of what could happen, but not really being able to give details of their mission as this was confidential. This part of the documentary was gripping and rather devastating. To know that one is so near death and to not be able to see your loved ones again are two very harsh realities to face under already so much pressure. The will to live essentially fights with the rational mind who understands that the chances are low that anyone could survive such a dangerous situation. The SAF troopers explained in the documentary that it did not make sense to them that no one was coming to their rescue or to the rescue of the 55th Unit. The SAF troopers had to endure non-stop fire and shooting from the rebels from around noon until about 4 in the afternoon. The senior officer with the Seaborne Unit, who had been radioing about needing help, communicated with their tactical command unit again and asked for what he called artillery support. He made it clear to his superiors that if by evening they had not received any kind of support, the command post could safely assume that their unit would be dead. It seemed that this last-ditch effort plea worked because at 5:30 in the afternoon, and with some reports saying that it was actually 6:30, white phosphorus was dropped around 100 meters from where the Seaborne Unit was hiding. This was in an effort to disperse the rebels and scare them off, and it worked. But even this measure was too late. When the Seaborne Unit felt like it was safe enough to move again after the gunfire from the rebels stopped, the troopers started gathering their dead and wounded. The unit started counting and realized that 8 troopers were killed in action and another 15 were wounded. The devastation sustained by the 55th Unit was still unknown at this point. Survivors of the Seaborne Unit would later describe the aftermath of what happened in Mamasapano. There was lots of blood, and they could smell it prominently. As the day progressed, reinforcements would be dispatched to where the Seaborne Unit and the 55th Unit were in order to claim their fallen fellow troopers. But the initially dispatched number of troopers to do so were not enough. There were too many dead troopers, and more help was needed to collect the bodies. At the end of the retrieval operation, the SAF troopers counted 44 casualties, and later on, these troopers would be known as the SAF 44. It was at this point that the surviving troopers had to ask again as to what on earth had happened. How come they were not given reinforcements and help? Soon enough, not only the SAF troopers were outraged, but also the whole nation. In the midst of all this, I can only imagine the anguish of the families left behind by those troopers who died at Mamasapano. Some of them would have received phone calls or text messages perhaps in the last moments of their loved ones' lives, and here they are, finally confronted by the same reality that they so feared in those moments after they had last spoken to their loved ones. It is an unimaginable pain. Now, even though we now know what took place at Mamasapano, it is important to know that whilst the encounter was still taking place, several individuals in high-ranking positions in many other locations in the country were also making decisions that would inevitably influence how the ongoing encounter in Mamasapano would turn out. Before I get into that, I just wanted to quickly add here that by February 2015, the FBI confirmed that the person killed in the hut during Oplan Exodus was indeed Marwan. They were the ones who tested his DNA against a profile they had from his brother, and it was a match. I thought I'd share that now for completeness sake before I dive into the people and events behind the encounter, so to speak. I'm happy to call this part of the story, well, the blame game. As the media learned more and more about what happened in Mamasapano, it became quite clear that a few things have gone wrong that ultimately cost the lives of the 44 SAF troopers. The first issue I would identify here was the decision not to inform the army beforehand and not to include them in the planning. We now know that Police General Napena, someone who was also privy to Exodus, only started notifying some army officials on the morning of the 25th of January. The military unit that had jurisdiction over the area to which Mamasapano belonged was apparently informed, but I personally got the impression that only officials were informed and not necessarily the soldiers on the ground. It would also later come out that Police General Napeñas started communicating with the so-called Ad Hoc Joint Action Group around the same time. The Ad Hoc Joint Action Group is a mechanism under the ceasefire agreement that outlines how security forces of the Philippine government, which includes the military, and the MILF, would coordinate in addressing lawless elements and terrorists in areas with MILF presence. Now, of course, I'm not a police or an army expert, but I truly believe that in addition to coordinating with the army units on site, the SAF mission could have benefited from including this joint group in their planning of Oplan Exodus. But I digress. Police General Napeñas was essentially asking the joint group that they get in touch with the MILF leaders to let them know that this operation would be taking place. I get that the SAF was balancing a lot of interests here. They did not want to jeopardize the peace talks, and they also did not want to inform the MILF way ahead of time in case they felt the need to help out Marwan, perhaps, in escaping from Mamasapano. Nevertheless, I felt like informing these important groups and individuals this late into the operation seemed somehow useless. As the firefight was gaining momentum and it became clear that the SAF troopers were trapped, the PNP communicated with the Army's 601st Brigade Commander, Colonel Melquiades Feliciano, and instructed him to coordinate and work with the MILF leaders to essentially help the SAF troopers in withdrawing from the area. Again, at this point, I do not think the soldiers on the ground were actually informed. Only their superiors did, because Rappler would later report that some soldiers near Mamasapano noticed the SAF troopers, as I already mentioned, but they were clueless as to who they were and why they were there. When the shooting started, the soldiers did not necessarily know who was shooting at whom. And this makes me think that they did not get any orders about reinforcing the troopers until much, much later. According to the documentary Fallen, Not Forgotten, some army officials felt completely blindsided about what happened in Mamasapano, having only been informed when things started getting more precarious for the troopers on the ground. Some army officials would also state in the documentary that Purisima was in constant communication with then President Aquino, and despite the clash taking place in Mamasapano, reassured the president that things were going well. Things were, of course, far from well. Now, on the issue of reinforcement, reports would later say that by daybreak on the 25th of January, reinforcement was finally dispatched in the form of tanks. But as I understand it, the tanks later on could not get anywhere near any tankable area, rendering their presence completely useless to the SAF troopers who were badly in need of their help. Now, let's get into the issue of the ceasefire. The idea of the ceasefire came up as early as around 6 in the morning on the 25th, and yet nothing could be agreed until around 6 hours later at noon. Meanwhile, the MILF thought that the AFP was the one shooting at people in Mamasapano. So, on top of trying to agree a ceasefire, the AFP had to appease their MILF counterparts in order to safeguard the status of the peace talks and come to an agreement about the SAF troopers. Meanwhile, we now know that as early as 7 o'clock in the morning, The 55th Unit had already suffered some heavy losses. Senior Inspector Ryan Pabalinas radioed Napeñas and Deputy SAF Commander-Chief Superintendent Noel Talino asking them for help. That would be the last time they would hear from him. Pabalinas would later become one of the 44 troopers who lost their lives that day. So, at this point, the only people who knew about what the Seaborne Unit and the 55th Unit were going through were officials of the PNP SAF and some army officials. Now, bear in mind that although then President Aquino knew of Operation Exodus, he did not necessarily know that things had gone completely south at this point. The first politician, if you will, who learned about what was going on was actually Mar Rojas. He was with Aquino that day in Zamboanga to visit the site of a bombing that took place just days before. I thought that at least at this point, Rojas would have informed the president, but as it turned out, Aquino still remained in the dark for a few more hours. The media, I'm suspecting, had not caught wind of what was going on. By midday, or shortly after, the ceasefire was implemented. This was the ceasefire, as you can remember, that essentially only the SAF troopers obeyed, whilst the rebels were getting ready to fire at the troopers again, only an hour after the ceasefire was agreed. At this point, there was local intelligence from the community in Mamasapano that dead bodies were lying around everywhere. And so, 2 crisis teams were formed, and their function was to rescue any surviving troopers and collect the bodies of those who had fallen. I am assuming here that since this was a last-minute plan and not really a pre-planned contingency, which would have made way more sense, the crisis teams scrambled to get together and form this plan. When they started moving into the areas where the shooting was taking place, they were met with gunshots themselves, and some of them had to abandon, regroup, and try to enter Mamasapano again. We know from what was said earlier in the episode that between the hours of 12:30 and 4 o'clock, the firefighting continued and only got worse as the hours ticked by. These crisis teams were badly needed. Now, shortly after 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the crisis teams finally made some headway at this point and were able to retrieve some fallen SAF troopers after having received assistance from the municipal mayor of Mamasapano, Mayor Benzar Ampatuan. Now, I know what you're thinking, and I had the same thoughts as well. I know that there are reports out there and people who believe that maybe the Ampatuans were behind the rebels who attacked the SAF troopers. I don't want to get into that side of the story because I could only find a very few reports that were reliable. And so I'm going to continue with the story without looking into the Ampatuan side of things. Now, back to the story. We know from earlier in this episode that around 5:30 or 6:30, white phosphorus was deployed to scare the rebels away from where the SAF troopers were. And just in time for primetime TV, the media had finally caught up with what was happening. Some outlets had started reporting about 27 dead SAF troopers, but of course, we now know that there were more than that. By around 9 in the evening, the retrieval efforts were still not done, but a General Espina had finally come forward to give a statement. He had the difficult task of informing the public and therefore the families of the fallen SAF troopers that there had been casualties. He also needed to tell the public that they needed to abandon the retrieval efforts for the evening because it had become too dark. Instead, the priority at that point was to rescue the remaining Seaborne Unit troopers who were eventually picked up at 11:30 that evening. I think we can safely assume that President Aquino at this point would have seen the media's reporting of the encounter, but from what I understand, he did not get a proper and official briefing about the clash in Mamasapano until the next day, on the 26th of January. Reports would later reveal that Rojas wanted to talk to high ranking officials of the army and police before informing the president. He demanded to know who was responsible for Operation Exodus, who knew it was going to take place, and how much did the army know. The questions fell specifically on Napeñas, who told Rojas that orders to neutralize Marwan within Operation Exodus came from Purisima. After this meeting, Rojas himself faced the public and addressed the nation. But he made the very grave mistake of calling the clash in Mamasapano a misencounter, to which policemen had taken offense, as it seemed to have a hint of victim blaming. This and the public suspicion that Rojas may have known more than he had let on in the aftermath of the clash ultimately may have cost him some political capital. So, what of President Aquino? Well, he finally addressed the nation about what happened. What frustrated the people, however, was that it took the president 3 days to do so. The president spoke to the nation on the 28th of January at 6:30 in the evening. By the 29th, arrival honors took place for the SAF 44, and visibly absent was the president himself, who instead attended a car plant opening in Santa Rosa, Laguna. Naturally, and to be expected, this did not sit right with a lot of Filipinos who saw a blatantly disrespectful act in the midst of such great loss in service of the Filipinos. President Aquino did attend the necrological services for the slain troopers on the 30th of January, after which he met with the families left behind by the SAF 44 troopers. Again, I can only speculate whether the backlash made him ultimately commit to attending the necrological services. Needless to say, beyond the frustration and anger about Aquino's absence at the arrival honors, the nation wanted to be able to point their fingers at someone, put blame on someone, because the loss of so many lives did touch Filipinos worldwide. And eventually, fingers were indeed pointed, but this time at the army. However, the army firmly stated, especially through General Katapang, that they were blindsided and did not know until the day of the clash that the SAF troopers were in trouble. This was the position maintained during a press con on the 4th of February 2015. Later on, during a Senate hearing that was put together to investigate what happened at Mamasapano, General Katapang did admit that whilst he agreed to send support to the SAF troopers, he also ordered his army to not shoot at the rebels, lest this endangered the peace talks. Then Senator Alan Cayetano rightly pointed out that these two orders, or two objectives, were contradictory and at odds with each other. Surely, both objectives could not be realized at the same time or at all. Furthermore, we do know that the army did manage to send in some support in form of a tank instead of other artillery support or perhaps individual soldiers, but unfortunately, as we already heard, this action was unsuccessful. Again, the only thing that helped in the end was the white phosphorus that was dropped near where the SAF troopers were. But even then, the SAF troopers already sustained heavy loss. So, remember General Napeñas, Well, he was not happy with what General Katapang said, both during the Senate hearing and the press con, because it was Katapang who faced the public during the press con in February. Napeñas reiterated that he gave the army enough notice and the army knew on the day what was happening in Mamasapano. General Napeñas also said that the army knew where the troopers were way ahead of the clash that happened in Mamasapano. He also made it abundantly clear in the documentary Fallen Not Forgotten that he had asked for artillery support quite early on and continued to do so. He contacted several people, some of which claimed they did not know about Exodus until much, much later. Napeña said that he communicated with General Espina, his superior Purisima, and another general called Guerrero and also Pangilinan. And whilst he could have communicated with Mar Rojas as well, he did not do that as that would be going against the chain of command. Espina would later deny this and say that he only learned about Operation Exodus much later. Now, in the documentary, some army officials tried to explain that, yes, at some point they did receive the location of the SAF troopers, but the army, bizarrely enough, did not trust the coordinates given to them because they were not in a form that the army understood. The Armed Forces of the Philippines trains soldiers to learn the U.S. military tactical maps. The coordinates given by General Napeñas were apparently lifted from a Google Maps search. PNP officials vehemently denied that the coordinates given would have caused any issues in finding the troopers. In fact, they said, the coordinates given were from an almost real-time military-type satellite map, guided by modern GPS technology to pinpoint a certain location. The army, therefore, should not have had any difficulties in finding the troopers. And so, we're back with the blame game. But of course, the blame game did not stop there. This time, the targeting of Napeñas became even stronger. It would later come out that despite repeated inquiries by the president about the status of any coordination with the army before Exodus was executed, it was Napeñas who advised against it. Remember when I said we're going to come back to this? Well, when asked why on earth he would advise against coordinating with the army, Napeñas simply said that the army in Maguindanao was compromised. He implied that there was a leak. In past operations that were planned with the army, the targets of the PNP would almost always know about the incoming troopers, which then allowed them to escape. It was almost implied in the documentary that coordination with the army takes time away from just proceeding with a plan. Coordination with the army as well meant compromising, deferring to the army in some aspects, and perhaps needing to relinquish some control to them. It looked like this was something that the PNP SAF officials were not prepared to do with Operation Exodus. Now, Napeñas and those who defended him at the time added that despite the advice that he gave or the recommendation that he made in relation to the issue of coordinating with the army, in the end, Purisima was the one who either approved or refused such advice. And Purisima approved the advice given by Napeñas. Those who were supportive of Purisima disagreed and maintained that the buck stopped with the president. Despite maybe not having all the information at the time, a lot of people felt that, in the end, the president was responsible. Some political pundits would put forward later that what happened at Mamasapano ultimately had a huge effect on the election results of 2016. It was seen as a great failure of the Aquino administration that led the people away from whoever allied themselves with the Aquinos. Anyway, back to Purisima. All eyes were on him at this point. What added insult to injury in this unfortunate case was that Purisima, a close personal friend of the president himself, was actually suspended 2 months before Oplan Exodus. The big question, therefore, was how on earth was he allowed to plan and oversee a special high-risk operation that involved the best of the best from SAF when he should not even be working? He was accused of alleged corruption, and this was the reason he had to be suspended. And yet, he was still able to impose orders within the PNP and approve the recommendation about not coordinating with the army. Lastly, he was also the one who committed to coordinating with Katapang once the SAF troopers were on site, something that in the end he did not do, but Napeñas did. Now, one last thing about Napeñas. It would later be reported that he was the one who assured the SAF troopers that there would be enough artillery to support them in case they needed it, something that turned out to be not so true. Additionally, the operation never had a contingency plan for when the mission needed to be aborted. Whether this was something Napeñas should have thought of, in the end, Purisima was the one overseeing the operation. Now, you can probably guess where this was heading. Despite Purisima's close ties with the president, it was his head that was needed on the proverbial silver platter. So, on the 5th of February, Purisima resigned, or was forced to resign, and the president announced that he accepted this resignation. By the next day, however, Purisima spoke out and denied having any hand in the Mamasapano operation, a big statement that was rather at odds with what everyone was saying and certainly at odds with his own behavior. As for Napeñas, he took responsibility right away for his part in the operation and was later relieved of duty. Shortly after, he retired, but tried his luck in politics when he unsuccessfully ran for senator. By March of the same year, the PNP Board of Inquiry released their investigation report. This report implicated Purisima, unsurprisingly, for acting without authority. The report also stated that President Aquino bypassed the chain of command by allowing Purisima to oversee and plan the operation despite his suspension. Now, remember earlier when I mentioned a Senate hearing? There were actually a series of hearings, and after those hearings, the Senate released a report stating that the quote-unquote first sin in the clash belonged to the MILF. Of course, the MILF took offense and said that it was indeed the SAF troopers who fired at the rebels first. This was no surprise, since admitting to this first sin would be derailing the peace talks with the government and also the army. By September 2015, the NBI, or the National Bureau of Investigation, had become involved and filed criminal complaints against 90 individuals. This decision came about after a report was published in April, which recommended bringing charges against members of the PNP SAF. Along with these individuals, the complaints included the names of several MILF rebels and Bangsamoro Islamic freedom fighters. Eventually, 2015 turned into 2016, and not a lot of progress was made in the case. And in an election year, pretty much everything takes a back seat in the midst of heavy campaigning and the election itself. And that is exactly what happened to the Mamasapano clash case. The next big movement in the case came in early 2017, when Duterte had already been sitting president for a few months. Essentially, on the second anniversary of the Mamasapano clash, the ombudsman filed with the Sandigan Bayan criminal charges against Purisima and Napeñas over the botched operation. If found guilty, the two retired PNP generals could face 12 years in prison. Surprisingly, former President Aquino was not included in these charges as he was facing a separate complaint that was still being investigated by the Ombudsman's office. On the same day, President Duterte ordered the creation of a commission to investigate the botched operation at Mamasapano. I have not seen any reports or articles that talked about any progress or any milestones that was made within this commission. By July 2017, the Ombudsman indicted President Aquino with one count of graft and usurpation of authority for his role in the botched police operation. The families of the fallen 44 then filed a motion for reconsideration and insisted that the president also be charged with 44 counts of reckless imprudence resulting in homicide. I do not think you will be surprised to know that the president made sure to file his own motion for reconsideration to essentially ask that the charges against him be dropped. 2 months later, in September, the Ombudsman was ready to decide on the motions filed. Ombudsman Conchita Carpio Morales denied the president's appeal and affirmed the charges against him, which essentially meant that the motion filed by the family of the fallen 44 was denied. Aquino would not be charged with 44 counts of reckless imprudence resulting in homicide. But the surviving families of the fallen 44 would not give up without a fight. They decided to escalate the matter to the Supreme Court 2 months later in November. They petitioned the Supreme Court to review the decision of the Ombudsman. In the same month, and finally, the anti-graft court at Sandigan Bayan charged President Aquino with one count of graft and usurpation of official functions for allowing Purisima to participate in Operation Exodus despite his suspension. This, of course, echoed the complaint that was filed by the Ombudsman. For 2 years after that, the families of the fallen 44 kept on waiting. By the 4th anniversary of the Mamasapano tragedy, the families gathered at the Supreme Court seeking justice. But the families would be greatly disappointed later that year when the Supreme Court dismissed a petition seeking to charge Aquino with homicide over the incident in 2015. On top of that, the charges of graft were also dropped, clearing Aquino of all liability in the Mamasapano tragedy. So, sure, the late President Aquino honored the SAF 44 with medals posthumously, and sure, current President Duterte made sure that January 25th would become a national day of remembrance. But all these things are superficial and do not really mean much in the grand scheme of things. They do not make a difference because at the end of the day, the families are still waiting for justice. And this wait remained painful. By 2020, the anti-graft court ruled in favor of Purisima and Napeñas. Remember that Purisima and Napeñas were charged with violating Section 3A of the anti-graft law, which punishes persuading, inducing, or influencing another public officer to perform an act constituting a violation of rules and regulations. The public officer, of course, in this regard would be President Aquino. The court said that since the